So at the current conference I'm at, I've got a workshop on how to use foreign language, and I believe this is an untapped storytelling device for a lot of authors. Part of it is in the current environment, we are really have this thirst for multicultural and intercultural types of stories. And I have been, since really my early school years, I've been a fan of learning at least a second language. In America, it's a second language. If you're in another part of the world, it's fourth or fifth language. So Trevor Noah, I think, is a talk show host. I think he knows 5 languages. He's from South Africa. So what I've learned, though, particularly in my teens and early 20s, is that understanding, in my case it was French, gave me a window into a culture, into a different way of thinking about everyday life that allowed me to richen my own experience and be more empathetic and more sympathetic to other people and from coming from different places. And right now at Florida State, I teach social entrepreneurship, which I term as sustainable social change. You can't do that unless you understand where someone else is coming from. And so we spend easily a fourth of our time, or a third to 40% of our time in our curriculum, just developing this understanding of other cultures and where people are coming from. So what this does as an author or as a storyteller, it opens up a whole new world of plot lines, a whole new world of arcs, a whole new area of tension and conflict that may or may not be resolved. And in fact, I have this great clip from a TV series where it shows how we can play on stereotypes to actually get us to think about other kinds of issues because of what we bring into any scene or everyday life about what we think about someone who speaks French. Well, where are they from? Or Spanish. Or you can get into the confusion of the difference between, say, Mexican Spanish and continental or Spanish, classic Spanish, and how those interpretations actually shift and change, and that actually creates dimension to a story. So it's tricky. So in other words, I really benefited from having French as having a solid background in it. Never was fluent, was at a point I could become fluent. I've actually given speeches in French, but being coached by native French speakers. So but what I found, particularly in my pirate series, is that this is a multicultural experience. If we're talking about pirates in the Caribbean in 1780, we're talking about the influence of Spain. We're talking about the influence of France. We're talking about the influence of the American colonists, who are themselves a melting pot of Scots and some Irish and English, and we have all the colonies. So what you can do is use really simple foreign language markers to differentiate characters. And I actually began thinking about this intentionally when I got a response from a judge in a literary competition. When in the comments that they gave us, which was very fortunate because we could get those, they said it really helped having a character, instead of saying yes, of course that's what it is, they say sí, of course that's what it is, because sí is yes in Spanish, and then you mark it in the text so that people identify it. And that immediately gave them a context for interpreting that language and that person. So that's a really simple thing. In today's culture, everybody knows non, si. We can even do a little bit of German if we want. You can set it up in your story. And so I think there's a lot of untapped potential. The problem is not going too far. You have to know the limits of what you know in foreign language and your network. So I'm not fluent in Spanish. However, I have a lot of people in my network who are fluent in Spanish and native speakers in Spanish. So they help me flag any pitfalls I might have and say, well, if you're in Venezuela, you wouldn't say this. Or if you're in Mexico, you wouldn't say this. Or if you're Puerto Rican, and a lot of my stories I do have another series that's sort of set in American context. If you're in an inner city Puerto Rican neighborhood, it's very different than if you're in an inner city Cuban American neighborhood. So in the workshop, I sort of go through this, but I think we are intimidated by foreign language because Americans just aren't introduced to foreign language. But if you're willing to take that step, little things can make a big difference in the story and identifying and defining characters, and then also setting up action. And so again, in the conference workshop that I run, which I can do anywhere. I mean, it's FWA, Florida Writers Association, which has been very generous in giving me a platform for experimenting with this. I talk about how you can use someone from a foreign language background to actually set up tension and humor that keeps the reader engaged. And again, there's this clip I use from Trevor Noah where he talks about a French person who's migrated to Atlanta. And even though Trevor understands and is fluent in French, you'll see it if you see the clip, he misunderstands the French person who's trying to speak English. And there's this really hilarious exchange about what happens. And so again, but it has to be intentional. It has to be deliberate. It can't be throw off. And so there's some things that we can do, some really simple things. One, don't go beyond your own knowledge. And most of us now have a command of yes, no, and please, and some of the basics. Two, making sure that that character and that language is not gratuitous. In other words, you're just not throwing it in. It actually has to fit the character. So in my pirate series, I have a Spanish army captain. So I use that to differentiate that. And then when he wants to communicate with another major character, they do it in Spanish. But the other thing is, every one of my Spanish words and phrases, I filter through someone who is native to the language and can help me identify that. I'm fortunate in that I can do a lot of that with French, but even in French language, all languages change. So you have to make sure you're using the right words at the right time and understand how modern audiences might interpret language differently from even when I was taking it in school. And Google Translate is great, but it's only a starting point. It's sort of like I tell my students at Florida State, Wikipedia is a great place to start, but is not in and of itself legitimate research. So what you can do is get onto Google Translate or Duolingo or a number of different apps and begin to experiment with different phrasing and see what works. And there are things you can do. For example, I actually supervised some translation projects in an earlier life in a different career. So one of the things you have to do in Google Translate is very flexible because you don't just translate the English into the other language, then you have to back translate. And professional translators do this. So what happens is when you back translate, you reverse it. So I translate English into Spanish, then I take that same Spanish phrase, and then I put it in and have it translated back into English. You'll know if you really get it or not. And there are so many different ways of saying the same thing that understanding that context is important. And so there are tools and techniques, but if you're deliberate and intentional and take it seriously and really think about how that layers into the story, I think it's really something that more authors should be doing. And I think it will create new markets for their books. And it will, I think, readers really respond to it. I've never had a reader complain about my Spanish language. Even in one of my books where the family dynamic is, the lead character is a first-generation Hispanic from Puerto Rico. Actually, her parents, one's Mexican and one's Puerto Rican. I use that to create some tension within the family dynamic. But part of what I did was use the Spanish language to actually create a world within a world in it. Now that took a lot of planning and intentionality to do that. And you can't have lots of dialogue you can't have lots of dialogue in a foreign language because you're going to lose the American reader. But you can do phrases, and then you can provide context for them to understand the phrase. I've been fortunate; I've not yet had a reader fumble over how I've used foreign language, but we had to do it carefully.